Hello everyone, we are Group 4 and I'm Rudrash. Me, along with my teammates Ellie and Ka, would walk you through our leader's presentation. So without further ado, let's begin. Our leader serves as a senior product manager at Origin. It's a public benefit corporation working in the correctional technology and rehabilitation space. She brings over 2 decades of experience spanning education, sustainability, and technology, which gives her a broad and values driven perspective on leadership. What makes this conversation meaningful to our course is that Origin operates in a morally complex environment. Incarcerated individuals are often forgotten when we talk about the society, yet they remain human beings who deserve dignity and opportunities. This has resonated with a guest lecture that we had in our intensive weekend. Now, we chose her because she leads mission driven work where profit is difficult, but the social need is massive. And the tension between purpose and sustainability is intriguing and at the same time worth exploring and needs to be talked about in the realm of common good. With that context in mind, we asked her a question about where this mission driven work truly begins, and that brings us to our next slide. So let me just pull my tab down a bit so you can see the title. Here we go. And when we asked her what inspired this work, she shared that Origin began by asking one simple but powerful question: how can we do good for people who society ignores? Most companies build their business model first and later add a do good component. But here, purpose came first, strategy followed then. Her story deeply influences that purpose. She grew up as a daughter of immigrants in a low income family and had to fight for access to education and resources that many of us take for granted. She told us, I owe it to the people like me to help them navigate systems that were built against them. This personal alignment with organizational purpose reflects the truly human leadership model, caring for people not just as workers or users, but as humans with dignity and potential. And that mission shapes Origin's culture. Every hiring decision, every product update, every partnership is evaluated through a values first lens. And on that note, I would like to invite Ellie to take the presentation further.
So origin, looking at this slide specifically, so the tablet on the left is is what the product that the user essentially uses. It provides this a secure educational platform. It's built for correctional facilities, so it offers secure tablet computers connected to cloud-based learning and communications with people outside of prison facilities. The product is used by incarcerated learners, so they have access to academic content, workforce training, vocational courses, and communication tools via this Origin tablet. So then the facility, looking at the interface of it, so prisons or jails partner with Origin. The institution purchases and arranges for the tablet and the platform access, which is funded by the correctional jurisdiction that it sits in, and then implements workflows, so vetting content and then integrating it with the facility's security protocols that they have. They also monitor the usage from that point forward. So, for example, there's no cost barrier for the learner themselves. They don't charge them or their families. It's taken care of by the jurisdiction, and then they tailor a pathway for each learner using the uh, the tablet. So the facility provides, obviously, they have the secure environment, they have the infrastructure, the tablet, the network, and the monitoring, and then they enforce the rules. So content gates, security reviews, and then they coordinate with Origin on analytics and the learner's engagement. So Origin supplies like the hardware and the software, and then they curate curriculum, data analytics, and then manage the learner's experience on the platform with the correctional facilities constraints in mind. And then that ultimately, hopefully, results in the incarcerated individual having the opportunity to build skills, earn credentials, prepare for employment after they're ultimately released from their sentence, and it interrupts this cycle of purely punitive incarceration and reentry. That's the goal. So, moving along, kind of a little bit of a pivot, bear with me, but the US, so on the federal level, the United States has no federal data privacy law that applies across the board, the same to each place. Instead, there's like this patchwork of state laws that's formed, like underneath each. So California has some privacy laws, Colorado, Utah, I think it's about like 19 states total that have essentially incorporated some form of data privacy, whether it's you've seen consenting to cookies when you access the corporation's website. There's some criteria in some states. So it's tricky because you want to make sure that you're in compliance with laws that exist. And a company like Origin that's very ethical is wanting to engage in best practices, but with varying standards in each state. Maybe California has higher compliance for privacy laws as opposed to one that has not enacted any. Data use and enforcement can be really tricky and confusing. So one conversation I had with our interviewee was how Origin weighs when there's ambiguity in the laws, some states having some states not, and no federal level of mandating this form of compliance, how Origin weighs risk of privacy laws that may eventually be implemented but don't exist right now. And so, like, not exploiting the user for no laws existing at that point, making sure there's still privacy protections, but still keeping the best outcome for the incarcerated user in mind when privacy laws and other privacy laws that you might not even think of from like a tech standpoint, like your HIPAA constraints. HIV is a common problem within prisons, making sure you're in compliance with if they're speaking with a therapist, if they're speaking about health concerns, you're in compliance with those as well, but not limiting innovation for making sure that the user gets the highest amount of benefit off of using the product. And she mentioned that privacy sometimes yields to security, but they still balance the ethical intent and they make sure that it's decision by decision with how to tackle those things. So protecting vulnerable data as opposed to providing life-changing access to these rehabilitation tools is always a question that sparks up when they're deciding about what level of compliance, not necessarily like always they're in compliance with laws that exist, but maybe we don't need to go making sure like it's infringing on an area where the user would only benefit, and there's not clear-cut rules. There's just ambiguity that exists in the laws of these times. So I thought that this connected to the corporate lobbying dilemma that we've been talking a lot about in class. So, do firms act cautiously to avoid risk, or do they boldly serve the common good? This is kind of a spin of not just lobbying for a tax cut, but something that's trying to provide a positive outcome for its user, lobbying for efforts where maybe privacy laws would hinder the goal of the most ideal outcome with data analytics and making sure we're getting to a place of a rehabilitated individual. But yeah, taking real responsibility and engaging with the risk and not just necessarily avoiding it, I thought was super, super compelling. And when we asked her about balancing privacy and mission, she explained how prisons often restrict technology for security reasons, which makes sense, even when that limits positive programs. So the trade-off just reminds me of how in class we would discuss corporate lobbying. And in both cases, companies oftentimes have a choice between protecting themselves from risk and then advancing a broader social benefit. So some corporations lobby against reforms because there's fear that new regulations might hurt their profitability, and others would lobby for reforms because they see a moral duty in shaping a fair system, which I think Origin is really doing a perfect job at carefully balancing their values-driven approach of rehabilitating the individual, but showing how you can take risks for the common good and how these two things can actually coexist, like lobbying for positive efforts can be something that's in the conversation as opposed to just lobbying for what benefits profits. Yeah, so it's just proceeding with practical caution. A lesson I think a lot of companies could apply in their advocacy strategies when they're speaking with legislators or employing these lobbying firms. So, second, kind of diving into this idea a little bit more, corporate influence, privacy, and policy change is what that says. I'm sorry, I'm covering it, but so when privacy and tech laws are like data and data consent are lagging behind the innovation that we're seeing in our lifetime, firms often face like fuzzy then guidance as how to best proceed. So corporations could lobby for clear ethical regulation instead of exploiting this ambiguity. So Origin Consulting Experts, the way that I even discovered this firm is in one of my privacy classes when my professor noted that this company really seeks to go about things using best practice as opposed to, just trying to maximize profits, which I thought was really compelling. And in class, we kind of discussed how corporate power equals corporate duty. And there's like people's influence should shape better laws and not weaker ones. So companies that do hold massive influence over privacy norms, like these very large tech firms, could take notes from a company like Origin, who could lead with lobbying efforts towards strong protections for privacy, not minimal ones. So our class readings emphasize that lobbying is a moral act. It reveals what companies truly stand for. And her comments about blurry AI laws and privacy laws makes me think about how corporations could use their lobbying power constructively instead of waiting for lawmakers to catch up with how advanced we are with our innovation. Ethical companies could push for regulations that will protect their users and ensure fairness. If Origin can anticipate ethical risks for a highly constrained, sensitive environment like a prison, then large tech firms with far greater power, I see that they don't have an excuse to not lobby for laws that uphold privacy and human dignity, honestly. This, I think, connects directly to our class theme of the moral use of corporate influence. So lobbying shouldn't just be for self-protection. It should be a tool for shaping a more just system. And I think Origin is a beautiful poster child for that sentiment. And now Carl's going to speak a little bit further about our conversation with our interviewee and her notes. This was a really interesting conversation, just about the lobbying efforts and privacy, but she had much more to say. So Carl, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks so much, Ellie. One of the things that I first noticed when speaking with our leader is that every time we'd ask her a question, she was taking lots of notes. And the vocabulary that she used when she was speaking with us was very precise. And I'll come back to that word here momentarily, vocabulary. There was one word in particular she said that I really wanted to focus in on because it struck me, and that word was predatory. I'd planned to ask her this question about the complexity of working with stakeholders across jurisdictions at different states and different correctional facilities. And then she said this quote that really stood out in my mind. Corrections is a very predatory industry. So, in addition to being very forgotten and marginalized as a population, business as a whole is also very aware that in this vulnerable position, you're able to exploit, so to speak, this hard situation for a business opportunity. She explained that a good example of such a business opportunity would be a rival firm charging exorbitant amounts of money for people to call their loved ones who are incarcerated, knowing that they don't really have any other options. And as I was thinking about this example, I was immediately thinking of our own vocabulary, specifically the moral vocabulary. And the first question that came to mind for me was whether it's morally permissible for a firm to build a business model based on charging exorbitant fees to call incarcerated individuals. I, of course, am using this very small example, but I'm really trying to speak to this broader trend within the industry. Of course, maybe the phrase isn't morally permissible, but it could be something different. You could say, is it morally obligatory for firms to not pursue this sort of predatory business practice. As part of this project, I was able to speak with a second leader who also works at a tech organization. He's a very senior executive at a cutting edge AI firm. And he said something that kind of spoke to me. And it was very simple, but it was also very profound, especially in the context of these decisions that Origin faces. And so here's what he said. It was, like I said, simple. Most decisions are super hard. So I wrote this down in my notes as we were having our discussion while talking about whether it was morally permissible for a company, such as the one that this leader works for, to train its AI models on data that comes from artists or creatives. He provided the perspective of both the artists and the creatives and then of the organization. And I largely disagreed with his argument that it was permissible because this training was non-consumptive and non-competitive, very technical language. But ultimately, it got more complicated when we expanded the discussion. And instead of talking about this example of artists and creatives versus a big firm, we were talking about a model that mapped proteins. And when the company had made this model, instead of putting it behind a paywall as they could have, they actually made it freely available because its use would drive positive health outcomes. And in this sense, it very much served the public good. So a bit more of a complex way to think about this very significant issue, this hard decision of whether or not to train on public data. And this brings me back to Origin and our case study on BlackRock. So, as you will recall, recently we read about how BlackRock, the well-known investment management firm, ended up becoming an unlikely ally for climate change. And the simple logic here is that BlackRock was thinking about this in terms of timeframes, right? They weren't just thinking quarterly, but rather in terms of decades and how climate change could lead to trillions of dollars in portfolio losses. Now, it might seem like an unusual ally for Origin, right? But actually, timeframes are also underpinning the work that Origin does. And as our leader was explaining, this different view of timeframes really shapes why they don't follow the same business practices that we see from other companies within their industry. And here's the crux of the argument that our leader provided when explaining why the company is not trying to charge a lot of money for phone calls. 80% of incarcerated people will re-enter the population, and it behooves us to make sure that they stay out of this environment. And to make them successful at it, they need tools. That takes a long time. That transformation takes a long time, and we have to, in some ways, wait that out and do the hard work of making sure that we can do ethical economics in a space where that's just not the norm. And if we want to come back to our moral vocabulary as it relates to Origin, I would say that this concept of ethical economics is not simply pragmatic in the sense that it helps the entire community to have functioning individuals coming out of the prison system. I would also go so far as to say this is morally praiseworthy behavior from the firm. And now I'll hand it over to Rudresh to continue.
Thanks, Carl. As we shifted our conversation into the financial realities of our work, our leader shared what became one of the most important takeaways from our conversation. You cannot deliver on your why unless you actually exist. For mission driven organizations like Origin, profit is not about greed, it is the enabler of the long term impact. If the company fails, the mission fails with it. This reminded us immediately of the Machine Solutions Inc., a case where Ryan Gable had to consistently choose integrity even when the profitability suffered for a long time because of its parent company, PW's ideals and principles. We also connected to the idea of tentpole companies, which provide stability and service to entire communities. Their ability to uplift society depends on their ability to sustain themselves economically. In a similar way, Origin is trying to become a tentpole within the correctional environment, not by extracting values from incarcerated individuals, but by reinvesting value back into their rehabs and families. And that is where the ethical tension also lies. Our leader said it can feel slimy to care about the bottom line, but ignoring the bottom line would be irresponsible to the very people they aim to serve. Her message was quite clear. Compassion needs competence, purpose needs performance, ethics need economics. Mission is the soul, but profitability is the spine. Both must exist together for a business to stand and sustain the common good. And let me switch on the slides. And now to wrap up, we identified six major takeaways from her advice and from our discussion, which we wrapped it up into recommendations. First one, align purpose and profession. She emphasized that the work we choose should reflect our values. When personal purpose aligns with the organization's mission, energy and motivation become sustainable. When misaligned, either the person or the company pays the price. Treat financial acumen as ethical literacy. She reminded us that common good requires funding. Without strong financial discipline, even the best mission will collapse, and so will the impact. Embrace delayed gratification. She compared working in social impact to teaching. You don't always see the results tomorrow. You stay committed because lives are changing over time. Patience is not passive, it's a leadership discipline. Fourth, integrate ethics by design. She encourages us to build integrity into business models, not bolt it on later as a good add on. At origin, if you remember, the mission guides every decision, not vice versa. Lead with transparency and courage. She acknowledged that in tough industries, doing the right thing will not always be the easiest path. Our conversations about Coinbase in our discussion showed that neutrality can be complicity, and moral leadership means standing for something. Redefining success is the last one. She said, success should be measured not in quarterly metrics, but in human outcomes like dignity restored, families reconnected, people's given second chance. Ultimately, her message to us as future leaders is that creating the common good requires a blend of heart and backbone, idealism and financial discipline, impact and longevity. The organizations that truly strengthen society aren't the only ones, aren't only the ones that start with purpose. They are the ones that sustain it. And on that note, I would like to conclude the presentation. So thank you so much for listening to us.